Okay, hello everyone. Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of 3IE, I'd like to welcome you to this evidence dialogue on making markets work, evidence for smallholder impact. This webinar is based on 3I's recent systematic review on the effects of market access interventions. The Evidence Dialogues is a bi-monthly series focusing on evidence and insights on the effectiveness of approaches to international development. The series touches on a new subject each time and brings together some of the most experienced voices in our community. We invite you all to participate in the discussion when we get to that, and hope that you will enjoy listening in. My name is Berthe Snilstveit, and I'm the Director for Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE. At 3IE, our mission is to improve lives through better policies that are informed by evidence. And so we support and conduct studies and reviews that look at what works for whom, why, and at what cost in low and middle income countries. We also advocate for the generation and use of quality evidence more broadly and work in partnership with governments and agencies to promote the use of evidence. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping notes. When sending questions to the panel, please use the Q&A box and not the chat function. And please name the person that you are directing your question to. If the event is just disrupted for any reason, we'll shut it down and reach out over email. The event is being live streamed on YouTube and shared on social media. If you're joining our event via a live stream, please leave your questions in the comment box. Also, we encourage you to tweet any questions and points of view on Twitter. Please tag us at 3i News while you tweet and use hashtag evidence dialogues. So before introducing our distinguished panelists, I want to say a few words about our motivation for bringing this panel together. So we recently conducted this systematic review that's critically appraising and synthesizing evidence across 5 different types of market access interventions and their effects on agricultural, socio-economic, food security and nutrition outcomes for smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries. We identified nearly 300 studies, and this is the most comprehensive systematic review that we've ever completed at 3IE. So this is a very rich evidence base that offers insights for policy, practice, and research. With nearly 80% of the world's extreme poor living in rural areas, enhancing smallholder farmers' access to markets is central to boosting productivity and ultimately rural prosperity. In an area of constrained development budgets in particular, it's critical to ground interventions in the best available evidence. And so here we have a study with there is a lot of evidence, and there are also some encouraging findings. So to our panelists, so to start us off, we have 3i's lead specialist, Shannon Schisler, who will present the work that she's led. And then we are delighted to be joined by 3 distinguished guests. So Antonio Scognamio is an economist at the Agri-Food Economics and Policy Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, so FAO. David J. Spielman is the director of the Innovation Policy and Scaling Unit at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. And Hope Michelson is a professor of agricultural and consumer economics at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And so the bios of our speakers are available on the event website, and so I encourage you to have a look at those. And to our panelists, you are very welcome, and thank you for being here. So then I would like to start by asking Shannon to present the results of the review and the broad conclusions and implications to us. Over to you, Shannon.
Thanks so much, Berta. Hoping that my screen is visible. If I could just get a confirmation. Yes, okay, wonderful. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Very excited to finally be presenting this work. Feels like it's been a long time coming. Systematic reviews are never done alone, so while I'm presenting today, I just want to acknowledge the amazing team that we had working on this. And in particular, I want to thank Pierre Marianne, who led this project as the project manager, who was instrumental in both the analysis and the writing of this review, as well as in putting this panel together today. And Pierre will be joining us in the background as well to help answer any questions you may have about the review. Okay, so just before I dig into the specifics of our review, I just want to make sure we're all speaking the same language. What do we mean by a systematic review? So a systematic review is a structured, transparent, reproducible method for identifying, appraising, and synthesizing all of the available research evidence that addresses a specific research question. Systematic reviews minimize bias by using predefined eligibility criteria, transparent search strategies, and duplicate independent screening and data extraction. Unlike narrative reviews, we don't cherry pick certain evidence. We include everything that meets our eligibility criteria. Our process adheres to established standards such as Prisma, Cochrane, Campbell, and others, and involves the critical appraisal of all included studies. And all of our steps are documented in a published protocol. This type of transparency allows others to verify our methods, reproduce our findings, and to build on our review for future studies. All of our systematic reviews are available as open access documents, which creates shared knowledge that can benefit policymakers, practitioners, and researchers worldwide. Our outputs aim to support evidence-informed decision-making across contexts and sectors. Okay, so now to dig into our specific review, we know that market access is essential for agricultural transformation and poverty reduction, but numerous factors might inhibit farmers' abilities to either access or participate in those markets. So development efforts have increasingly focused on better integration of both poor and remote farmers into markets. And as these efforts have increased, so has the body of evidence. But there was no comprehensive and nuanced synthesis of that evidence. And so we felt this was a real opportunity for us to contribute to the field. So we compiled over 2 decades of research on market access interventions, including studies between the years 2000 and 2023. We included studies that used either experimental or quasi-experimental designs that aimed to establish a causal impact. And we did this across 3 types of interventions. I'll just describe them briefly with a few examples. So first, farm-to-market infrastructure interventions could include either domestic infrastructure like rural roads or bridges. It could also include export transfer infrastructure such as ports or border crossings. Under output market information, these activities provided farmers information through various means. They could be, for example, mobile, internet, peer networks, radio. They could also be interventions that invested in technologies that are required to access market interventions, information interventions, so such as phones or internet. Our third category was new marketplaces or alternative marketing opportunities. They included, for example, mobile or e-commerce marketplaces or alternative physical marketplaces. Under contract farming, we included things like fixed price and price guarantee contracts, production management contracts, credit supply contracts, among others. And then finally, interventions that improved storage infrastructures and technologies. So that could be on-farm storage, it could be off-farm storage, such as warehouse receipt systems. It could also be improvement of technologies to prevent spoilage during transit. So that was also included under storage interventions. In addition to evaluating one of those types of interventions, they had to report on one of our eligible outcomes. These outcomes are broadly based on our theory of change. I will just note that there are specific theories of change for each intervention type. Those are in the paper itself. I'm not going to go through each individual theory of change today. So broadly, I'm talking about outcomes that were eligible across our different intervention types. So first, if they report on intermediate outcomes, such as transaction costs, market risks, group participation, access to or use of credit, output prices or crop loss. We also included production outcomes, so yields, volume, quality, etc. Next, intermediate outcomes, so increases in either non or off-farm income or farm income or market sales. And then finally, welfare outcomes. And those were either total household income or wealth, or food security and nutrition outcomes. As Berta mentioned, the eligible population here was smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries, and we included any comparison group. So they could have had no intervention, they could have been part of an alternative intervention condition, or they could have been part of a pipeline or waitlist control group. Also, as Berta mentioned, this was our largest ever systematic review, and we started with screening over 52,000 records at the title and abstract phase, followed by over 2,300 full text manuscripts to assess their eligibility for inclusion. We ultimately included 439 papers, and those reported on 289 unique impact evaluations. The most common reasons for studies being excluded at the full text stage was either they did not have an eligible study design, that was about 43% of the excludes, or they had an irrelevant intervention, or they had no intervention at all. I would just also note here that we did critical appraisal of all of these included studies. There was a relatively high risk of bias in general among the studies, and those primarily came from either spillovers in the context of RCTs or in the context of the quasi-experimental studies, often risk of confounding due to unmet assumptions in the models. And breaking that down by intervention type, so for the 5 interventions, we had the most evidence for contract farming. We had the least evidence for improved storage, and then the other 3 intervention types had a fairly similar size body of evidence. But generally a large evidence landscape for us to draw from, which is very exciting. So I want to talk about the results. First, going to focus on results from each individual intervention type, followed by zooming out a little bit to some cross-cutting findings. So for everything I talk about on this slide, all of these results here are coming from a quantitative meta-analysis of all of these various outcomes. So just flagging that. So for transport infrastructure, we saw increases both in income and productivity. And for anyone unfamiliar with meta-analysis, Ks indicate the number of estimates in a given model. And so I've just noted them here just so you can get a sense of the size of the evidence. So increases in income, productivity gains, but both our qualitative and quantitative evidence did suggest that effects were smaller among female-headed households compared to male-headed households. For our market information interventions, these resulted in both higher prices and income. Authors did note that smallholder farmers are particularly vulnerable to weather and climate fluctuations, which can only be partially addressed, though, with better access to information. Under alternative marketplaces, we saw increases in group participation, in farm investments, in prices, yields, sales, and income. Here, authors noted that existing infrastructure helped to increase uptake. So, for example, an e-commerce alternative marketplace was more likely to work in areas that had pre-existing parcel delivery service connections. Contract farming, we found, improves yields, quality, sales, and income. This body of evidence was particularly heterogeneous, though. So even among studies which were evaluating programs within the same country. Again, here, both the qualitative and quantitative evidence did suggest that there were larger effects for larger farms. And that could be perhaps because contracts often require a certain volume or quality of production, or it could be because they had more access to credit or storage options. The exception to this was when farmers were transitioning from subsistence farming to commercialization, in which case small landowners had opportunities to sell to supermarkets at more stable prices. The analysis of barriers and facilitators also pointed to some power imbalances that hindered effectiveness. They also found that less educated farmers and farmers with less access to information benefited less from the interventions than more educated farmers or those with more access to information, for example, via a mobile phone. Finally, storage infrastructure interventions reduced post-harvest loss, increased adoption of storage practices, increased yields, sales, and income. And among these interventions, logistical organization of the storage infrastructure and technology either catalyzed the effect when it was well structured or hindered its implementation if it was poorly organized. I will note too here that we did not find any significant negative effects of any of our included interventions on any of our eligible outcomes. So zooming out just a bit, more broadly across intervention types, we're seeing a few things. So first, we saw that effects vary, but you may have noticed that for every type of intervention, I noted an increase in both farm income and total income. You may have also noticed that I never mentioned food security or nutrition, and that's because those effects were either too small to be meaningful or they were null effects. We also note that our evidence is concentrated in Africa. So 155 of the included studies come from sub-Saharan Africa. And just to put that in context, the next largest region was South Asia with 59 studies. We also noted that effects vary across subgroups. So smaller effects on vulnerable groups such as female-headed households, smaller landowners, less educated farmers, farmers with less access to information. And finally, evidence gaps for some of the more immediate outcomes like transaction costs or the quality of agricultural produce were clear gaps in the literature with insufficient evidence to synthesize. And so those might be interesting areas for future research. Impact evaluations, we looked at what authors said about what enabled either implementation of interventions or the effectiveness of the interventions. And then we used a thematic analysis to derive some barriers and facilitators. Across intervention types, authors noted that both the distance and the travel time to markets can be barriers to participation. They also note that access to education or resources or credit or other support is critical in order to exploit market information, adopt improved inputs, or access markets. And across chapters, authors highlighted the risk of information gaps as a potential barrier to impact. Programs not only need to provide the market tools themselves, but also to ensure that the beneficiary population can use them optimally. And this is a real driver of both participation and program effect. In addition, leveraging existing knowledge can really support implementation. So for example, in areas of high mobile connectivity, extant knowledge about mobile phones made text messaging a really good medium for an intervention. And finally, the physical and technical accessibility, but also reliability and maintenance of all of the market infrastructure is critical across intervention types. So ensuring that there's not slow broadband in a mobile-based intervention, ensuring that roads and bridges and storage facilities are maintained over time. These are all critical aspects. So based on all of the evidence that we reviewed, we came up with a few cross-cutting implications, both for policy and practice, as well as for research. One of the things that we noticed was that despite the quite large body of evidence on the effects of output market access interventions, there is a paucity of evidence on cost. And this might limit the ability of practitioners and policymakers to really understand the value for money of these interventions. Funding of cost-benefit analyses could potentially benefit and contribute to more accurate understanding of the picture. As we noted in our barriers and facilitators, it's critical to ensure physical and informational accessibility, that is to the relevant connection, whether that be internet or mobile, roads, and ensuring time and distance to the market is reasonable. And very critical to that is supporting the maintenance and long-term reliabilities of these services in order to have sustainable results. Researchers can address both regional and thematic gaps. So as I mentioned, Sub-Saharan Africa represents over half of the studies included in our analyses, but yet we had no studies from North Africa or from the Middle East. So these might be important regional gaps to fill. Similarly, you may have noticed the very large volume of outcomes for income and total income across most of the intervention types. And yet we still have gaps for things like transaction costs or quality of produce. We also noted that most studies evaluated a package of intervention activities. And so at times it was difficult for us to disentangle which particular activity was really driving the effect. And so evaluation of some of those individual intervention components might really help us to disentangle those. And finally, I noted a relatively high risk of bias among these studies. So, trying to develop approaches to mitigate those risks could improve both the reliability of the findings overall and our confidence in the quality of the evidence. So considering the multitude of interventions, as well as the heterogeneity, really raised questions about whether standardization of practice is needed, and one proven effective way to standardize practice and reduce research waste is to develop guidelines. So 3IE recently launched its pilot guideline program in order to increase the uptake of our highly relevant and rigorous systematic reviews. And in order to do this, we have first assess the applicability and transferability of existing guideline development and reporting tools. They come largely from the health sector. Tools include things like GRADE CERQUAL, the Jim McMaster checklist, WRITE and WRITE Adapt, among others. And we've also defined some key interest holder groups We know that key interest holders play a crucial role in guideline development and could include people like practitioners, citizens, advocacy groups, in this case, farmers, maybe ministries, essentially anyone who would be impacted by the recommendation of the guideline itself. Our goal is to establish a service which would support guideline development and contextualization activities across international development. But of course, we had to start somewhere, and we were really excited to start with this review. And so we know that, in particular, Chapter 1, which was about transport infrastructure, was a priority topic for our funder, as well as local communities. And so we decided to apply the grade summary of findings and evidence to decision frameworks to develop a guideline in this area. So we started by assessing the certainty of the evidence for Chapter 1 on transport infrastructure, and this resulted in a grade summary of findings table. This summary of findings table then feeds into the evidence to decision framework, also grade. The framework is a transparent and structured approach that relays the best available evidence to a panel who will then make judgments about intervention benefits or harms, values or preferences of beneficiaries and other stakeholders, and intervention feasibility, among other dimensions. And these judgments will lead the panel via a meeting to create a recommendation either for or against the intervention type. So we are currently at the stage of recruiting the panel. So our next order of business will be to have the panel meeting. And so we really hope that you'll stay tuned to our social media, to our newsletter, to hear more about this ongoing guideline development work. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Berta, who has some questions for our esteemed panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shannon. So picking up from where you left off, given the current context of shrinking development budgets, how can the findings of this review be used by decision makers in low and middle income countries? So let me first turn to Antonio. From your perspective at FAO, why are markets so important for rural transformation, and what should policymakers prioritize to strengthen them?
Thank you. Thank you for, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Antonio Scagnamillo, economist in the Agri-Food Economics and Policy Division of FAO. And thank you for inviting me to join this important discussion, because today is very important to understand how we can make market work better for smallholders that are usually the most vulnerable actor involved in the market, and do that through stronger evidence-based policy. So I think that this review is very timely. It's also impressive. Let me say that it's impressive how deep it is, how wide it is. And I think what struck me from the results of this review that may be used in the policymaking context is that the review highlights that markets are not just spaces where goods are exchanged. Basically, they are the infrastructure that connect producer, consumers, and opportunity for growth. What does it mean for me? It means that when markets fail, households cannot sell, cannot buy, and also cannot insure themselves against shocks. One of the program priority area, the FAO, the BL4, Better Life 4, is a resilient agri-food system. And to me, what is a resilient agri-food system is one where markets continue to connect people, places, and opportunities, even when a shock occurs. When a market fails, they not only disrupt incomes, they increase the systemic risks. because functional market lower the cost of managing crisis and help absorb shock, stabilize prices, and allow assistance to reach people faster. So when you say in a context of shrinking budget, well, market intervention should be understood as a resilience investment, not just as economic one. And if you frame them as a resilience investments, the multiplier of the investment is much higher than looking only to the economic dimension. Strengthening market is not just about growth, but is about building, let's say, the connective tissue of resilience across production, consumption, and nutrition. But another element that the review highlight is that market work only when they are functional, inclusive, and informed. It's an element that it's very important is the context specificity, no? Because it's not given for basically the projects that combine infrastructure with information or storage tend to perform better than single component one. But my understanding from the review is that this is not an automatic outcome because multiple component interventions are not automatically more effective than the single component intervention. And why, to me, why this happens is because the context specificity, so how the market functions, how the market are enabling environment in itself determine the final output, the final outcome, and so the final results. So in an era of fiscal tightening, this is where every dollar can do more, investing in the functions that market work. So creating an enabling environment and moving from a paradigm that is a project focus to a systemic logic. So it's related to what I was saying before. If we look at the market as an element, a crucial element for resilience of the systems, okay, it is also we have to move from isolated projects, I don't know, on inputs, on markets, and on nutrition. Instead, we need to align them within a single system that reinforces the linkages across production, trade, and consumption. Of course, this is easier to say than to make, and but I think this is the final take that I can summarize from this review from policymaker on how and where to invest the limited budget for having markets that works for everyone, leaving no one behind. Over.
Thank you, Antonio, for some very important and insightful comments. Turning to you, David, one of the key findings from the review is that the effects of market access interventions vary by context and different types of farmers. You've done extensive work on how to overcome challenges and barriers to implementing these types of interventions so that their benefits can be felt more broadly. Can you share some of your insights from this work?
Sure. Thanks for asking this question, and thanks to Shannon and Pierre and the entire team. This is a really, I think, fantastic systematic review. It's very thorough. It covers a lot of really interesting points that I think all of us have done interesting work on and have, considered in our own lives and research and practice. So here's what I'll say about sort of, inclusion and heterogeneity and issues like that. To me, looking at the systematic review, many of the interventions that were studied follow a very structured logic, which sometimes to me doesn't seem fit for purpose. So many interventions start with the assumption that well-functioning markets, well-functioning competitive markets, are the most efficient or first best mechanism for allocating resources to solve a particular problem. And, that's not problematic in and of itself. But one might argue that markets are sort of the edge case. Competitive markets are the edge case, or the outlier in a larger world of cases where markets are not a feasible first best solution for agriculture, especially in low and middle income countries. When we focus solely on market interventions, I feel like we're ruling out the vast majority of situations where the problem is about incomplete or non-functional markets, in which the first order solution may actually be the provision of public goods and services. So that means, for instance, public policies that ensure buyers and sellers have equal and full access to information clearinghouses, price tickers, price dashboards, or other sort of price discovery mechanisms or services, or public investments in the soft infrastructure, like binding and enforceable contract law to ensure that market exchanges are functional, or regulations that address situations where market fail to operate competitively, like antitrust or competition law, or tech innovations and tech finance innovations that reduce barriers to entry and support competitive market development, not the formation of, say, monopolies and cartels. And so on and so forth. Even educational investments that create entrepreneurs who recognize and respect ethical and legal boundaries within markets. So think of it this way: when the conditions of asymmetric information or anti-competitive behavior or unenforceable contracts or insufficient collective action among farmers or plutocratic norms, corruption norms exist, one might argue that market access interventions are not appropriate. They're less likely to succeed, or they're just premature. And certainly, they may, in many cases, generate very heterogeneous effects that exclude large groups of people within a population. Thankfully, I think the systematic review that we have here from 3IE is not silent on any of these issues, which is really appreciated. The review recognizes heterogeneity in the effects of market interventions, especially when it was discussing farm-to-market infrastructure, but also the other 4 categories of interventions it studies. The systematic review is very clear that there are no silver bullets, no one-size-fits-all, and that there's a need for continuous evidence generation on what works in these types of market interventions. I really like the point that was made about multi-component interventions not necessarily working as well as single component interventions in many of the cases that were examined. That's sort of the Tinbergen rule, right? To achieve a specific N number of policy outcomes or targets, a policymaker must have control over at least an equal number of effective and independent policy instruments. In other words, a singular intervention can't solve multiple problems. The finding on sort of lack of benefit costs and cost-effective analysis is also important. Indeed, many of us struggle with this, right? Because it's really hard to do ex post impact evaluations with cost-effectiveness analysis than it is to do it ex ante. There are a couple of other points I want to bring up, but I guess, to the question that was asked of me, I really appreciate the fact that the systematic review has sort of highlighted or spotlighted this issue of heterogeneous effects, in some cases, struggling to find effects that are inclusive, and asking for more research to be done in this space, because I think that all of us working in the space do recognize that the K's and the N's in this study are small, and that really calls for more work to look at these types of issues. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, David. Now, Hope, over to you. You've done interesting work on the challenges surrounding contract farming and food storage interventions in particular. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think the component that links contract farming and storage that I was thinking about a lot over the last couple of days when I got this prompt is risk. So both of those classes of interventions require that we think really carefully about risk. And there is some discussion of risk in the full systematic review, so I'd point people to that. Not a lot of that risk, kind of enumeration of risk and discussion of risk made it into the brief. So if you just look at the brief, you won't see as much of that. But contract farming and storage, they help farmers manage some risks, but they also introduce new risks, right? And that's really important to countenance in policy and also in evaluation. And I'm not sure as researchers that we're doing as good of a job as we need to in terms of thinking about how to measure those risks, how to anticipate those risks, and how to get policymakers to focus on those risks. So I'll talk about contract farming briefly and storage. So contract farming is a forward-looking arrangement in which a farmer or a group of farmers makes an agreement with a buyer in advance of harvest. Generally, it's regarding the quantity of agricultural product that's going to be transacted. Sometimes the quality or the specific variety is specified, but then generally a price is specified that's going to be the payment for the per unit cost of the produce. And so that's reducing some risk for farmers. So it's reducing price risk and marketing risk. But the new ones that come into play are pretty important and I think understudied. So the risk of contractual default, the risk of cultivating a specialized variety in a context in which other buyers may not have an appetite to purchase that. So Walmart's pretty famous for doing this. They specify a particular kind of cabbage, or they used to in Central America. So they're really locking you into a particular kind of niche growing area in terms of your product. And then the other one to think about a lot, which I've seen in a number of different contexts, is the holdup risk that comes into play when a buyer at the time of the purchase tries to renegotiate the terms of the contract. And they can do that because they have a lot of information, and the farmer tends to be quite dependent on the contract relationship in the places that I've studied. So that's really important, right? So we need to think about risk. We need to think about the kinds of risks that get managed and the kinds of risks that are new, that maybe farmers have less experience in managing. So in terms of storage, storage also introduces new risks. And some of them we talk about and we think about. So the risk of spoilage. So you hold on to your staple cereals after harvest, and you have to worry about spoilage and storage, and also the risk of kind of insect infestation and a degrading of quality over time because of those two pressures. But there's a recent paper that myself and my co-author Lila Cardell have published in AJE that I'm really proud of, because it documents a new risk that was not on the table. So I want to talk about for a minute. So many papers and policy interventions promote storage after harvest because on average, what happens to price dynamics in markets which are not well spatially integrated for staple cereals is that you have a trend in which the price is lowest at harvest, and then it increases throughout the year until just before harvest during the lean season, and then it falls again. And so the perception has long been, definitely within the development ag literature, I think also among implementers and NGOs, that if you can just get farmers to hold off selling, so if they don't sell at harvest, they're able to make these enormous gains by selling at this later price, right? So by not doing that, farmers are effectively leaving money on the table. So what we did was we analyzed about 20 years of price data from 1,000 markets, more than 1,000 markets in 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we found that about 16% of the time, the price does not rise after harvest. So it stays flat, or in many cases actually declines after harvest. And I can talk about why that's happening. We're doing some analysis to understand the drivers, though I imagine many of you have some in your heads as you're listening to me talk. So what that means is staple cereal storage then with the intent to sell, especially if you take credit at harvest, to do that is a risk. It's a non-trivial risk, and it's a non-trivial risk for small farmers, but also, and we really haven't looked at this in the research community, it's a risk for traders, right? For small scale traders are bearing that risk too. So, so solve some risks, introduces new risks. And I think we need to do a little bit better, push ourselves to think about looking for risks and quantifying risks. So in the context of shrinking development budgets, it's even more important to think about how these kinds of interventions allocate and manage risk. So both of the examples I gave you, they can improve incomes and outcomes for farmers, but under certain kinds of market conditions. And this relates to the finding of the systematic review and to what David was saying before, right? You've got to have market integration. You need to also think about, though, price dynamics. You need to think about market power. You need to think about different kinds of institutional conditions. And some risks are going to be context specific. So we have to do a little bit better about thinking about which interventions and what contexts under what kinds of risk management scenarios are going to deliver gains. So, and then as a coda, if I can just finish, we started that storage and price risk paper because I saw a conference presentation of a storage intervention that failed. So the person that was presenting it said, look, we did the storage, there was some credit, and unfortunately, the price failed to rise that year. And that got my attention. I thought that was very interesting because I'd never heard that story before. And so I think one thing that got my attention about the systematic review is something I think about a lot, which is this file drawer problem that we have, right? Which is nearly, I think all of the interventions that were studied in the wide breadth of interventions that were included in the systematic review had small but positive effects on the outcomes of interest. But we're missing something probably, right? There are tons of interventions that are not being published and are not necessarily being talked about because they didn't have positive effects. And I think a lot about what we need to be learning from those failures. And there are different kinds of initiatives within the research community that are trying to create incentives for documenting failures. But I really think we should be putting our effort into that at the same time that we're focusing on what works. So what doesn't work can also be really instructive as well.
Thank you, Hope, and some very good points there, including the issue of publication bias, which perhaps we can get back to later on in the discussion. And I think that some of you have touched on this a bit already, but we focused on the more the policy and practical implications of the findings. So let's talk a bit about what the findings mean for the research community, and how the findings of the review can help shape future research on market access interventions. And so, what are the key recommendations that you would offer to researchers studying impacts of these types of interventions? And so going to you, David, first, what are your thoughts on this? I know you've often emphasized the importance of designing impact evaluations with a clear theory of change, but that's not always done in practice. So could you share your perspective on this? Are you still muted?
You would think that I could figure that out, right? So here I'm going to push back a little bit on sort of the 3IE norm or the 3IE tradition. I've worked, or interacted with 3IE for many years in my capacity as a researcher at IFPRI, and I have a lot of respect for the organization. But I also, when we're talking about researchers and this particular question you asked me, I want to push back a little bit. So first of all, as guidance to researchers, I think it's very obvious that it's important to understand the market context and the sort of the market ecosystem before focusing on the evaluation of an intervention. Like I said earlier, sometimes the interventions we're interested in aren't actually addressing the first order problem, right? So, evaluating the impact of a digital marketplace app, for instance, I've done a lot in digital agriculture, is kind of a pointless exercise if there's some sort of monopsony or oligopsony market structure where buyers collude with each other to purchase the commodity, or the state is involved in setting the commodity price below some, say, equilibrium. So, what's the point of a digital marketplace that brings farmers to buyers and buyers to farmers when the price is already set outside of their interaction? That happens more than we realize, I think sometimes. We're often as evaluators, a hammer looking for a nail, um, and we miss the bigger picture. But but going to that point about theory of change, 3IE has been a great advocate, and Shannon highlighted it, I think, in her sort of recommendations going forward for research. 3I has been an advocate of a very clinical approach to evaluation, in which implementers and evaluators are sort of firewalled, right? Similar to the kind of clinical studies we do in medicine, to ensure independence and credibility of results. But market interventions are not pills, they're not shots, and they're not therapies, right? That can be easily, let's say, double-blinded. Um, Rather, they're complex interactions between heterogeneous agents. They require a more sensitive, what I believe is co-design process that brings implementers and evaluators together at the table to really understand the theory of change and maybe build it out together. Because as you said, Berta, many programs, many interventions are built without that theory of change, uh, you know, already available or at the table. And this is really important when you're working, especially if you're from a high income country or a university or institute like mine based in a high income country, when you're doing research in low and middle income countries, right? Think of the research decolonization agenda. One of the worst things we can do as evaluators is say, all right, so we understand your theory of change. We are going to fly into your country and parasitically parachute as evaluators, and evaluate your theory of change. And we're going to firewall any interaction with you as best possible so that you don't influence the results. I know those are unfair generalizations, right? But there is a very strong view in this space, and I get pushback all the time. So the evaluations I work on now are not firewalled, like maybe 3IA would prefer. Rather, we are co-creating the evaluation with the implementing organization to help them learn about, what they're doing well, what they're doing not well, how they might tweak their design, so on and so forth. And I would point out that Precision Ag for Development, um, and many other organizations take the same approach, and they step far back from this firewalling of, you're the implementer, I am the evaluator. So for researchers, I guess my advice is, recognize the context, recognize the ecosystem, and recognize your implementers' learning objectives before designing an evaluation, and co-create the evaluation with them, and put less emphasis on this clinical approach to research, in the study of agricultural markets in low and middle income countries, because I think it just doesn't serve us well. These are not shots, pills, and therapies. Thank you.
Right. So I feel I have to respond to some of those claims directly because I think that we very much agree with you, and that's part of also the challenge that we are seeing in the literature and flagging in our reviews. And I don't know when you last looked into how we do our evaluations and how we work with partners, but it's in a very different way from the what you are suggesting. So I think we very much work in partnership with both local organizations and implementers in designing evaluations that are policy relevant, that are contextually informed, and not primarily driven by academic agendas so I would encourage you to perhaps update your priors a little bit and have a look at our active work program. With that little side note, Hope, your work is focused on strengthening the rigor of impact evaluations and improving the precision of their results. What would you recommend to researchers working in this field?
Yeah, let's see. So one thing that I was thinking about when I returned to the systematic review this week, and that really struck me, was that you identified a high likelihood of bias in almost all of the studies, in the majority, I think, of the studies reviewed. I think 60%, or maybe a little more than 60%, were identified as having this high risk of bias, and 31% were considered to have some concerns related to the risk of bias, and 9% had low risk of bias. And there's this distinguishing between quasi-experimental designs and then randomized controlled trials. And one thing that I found really interesting that I actually would love to hear a little bit more, I went and looked for it in the systematic review and I couldn't find much explanation, is that RCTs, among the RCTs, which made up a good deal of the articles reviewed, interventions reviewed, was that 41% were assessed as having a high risk of bias. So the RCTs are often, I think this has gotten a lot more contested in important and interesting ways recently, but are often argued as the kind of gold standard for evidence. I'm not stating that. I think there's lots to say about that, but they tend to be characterized in that way. So finding 41% as having a high risk of bias, I thought was really striking. And I think digging into the details in the systematic review that it's coming from issues related to non-random assignment, spillovers, and like cross-contamination. So, and reporting bias. I actually don't know what reporting bias meant in the context of the study. So maybe at some point, somebody from the team could pop in and talk about that, because that's a really high number. And I think if we're sort of being careful about the evaluation of bias, and even RCTs, nearly half of them are assessed to have a pretty significant issue with potential bias. I think that's something that we should be thinking really carefully about. Maybe we don't need to be elevating and prioritizing RCTs, and maybe there's a kind of a humbling that needs to happen. I mean, which has already taken place, but maybe it's sort of further evidence of that. So that's really interesting, and I think it could be usefully unpacked, and maybe the study team could talk about that a little bit. So in terms of this question of kind of bias and evaluation, I was also thinking about this period that we're in already, of more constrained budgets, both for implementation and also for evaluation. And we've been living through these incredibly halcyon, like the halcyon days of, I think, development research. There's been a lot of interest, a lot of appetite for evidence, and a lot of money to spend on doing big evaluations. And I think a lot of us would say it still hasn't been enough, but I think we have had a bounty over the last 15 years, and I think that period is coming to an end. And so it's really important, right, to think about what we mean by rigor and care. And I think those conversations become even more critical, because we want that marginal dollar to go to the most effective place, right? This sort of period of scarcity means that we want to think really carefully about how we're going to allocate that money. And so, what 3IE has done here is, I think, comes at a very important moment in terms of guiding the way that we should be moving forward. At the same time, we need to be really pragmatic, and I think we need to go back to thinking about what the big issues are and where we should be using existing data to generate new insights. If we're going to have more constrained budgets for data collection and for evaluation, we're going to have to get a bit more clever and a bit more creative and a bit more forgiving or pragmatic about the kind of evidence that we are going to evaluate and balance, right? So we need to think about what levels and types of biases are tolerable, and what kinds of evidence are still useful for decision making, even when ideal designs aren't going to be feasible or affordable. I think we have to strike this balance between rigor and realism in the coming years. We still need credible identification. We need transparency, but we need to talk a lot about limitations, and we need to be really clear about assumptions. And I think, as I said before, we need to be more creative. So maybe using more household recall data to establish baselines, leaner surveys, collecting supplementary data from other actors who are salient to characterizing the market context, like agri-dealers or ministries of government, private companies, traders, getting information about prices, infrastructure, weather, soils. Remotely sensed data has some clear limitations at this point. I think we understand what some of those are, but also some opportunities. So I think we should try to make better use of the wealth of administrative, geospatial, and remote sensing data that we've got, and to think really carefully about what we want to collect and how to sort of situate that within the evidence that is publicly available. The point is not to lower the standards that we have here, but to be realistic about what we're going to be able to do, and to maybe broaden our toolkit to include things that are a little bit more publicly accessible at this point. So.
Great, thank you, Hope. Some very rich comments there, and maybe we can get back to some of it a bit later, including, I think that there is a whole issues that are being flagged around transparency and ethics that are not necessarily about more resources. It's about researcher practices. And finally then, Antonio, from your perspective at FAO, where do you think the priorities lie for research in this area?
Yes, it's very difficult to add something after David and Otto, because they touch a lot of argument or topics that are very, very relevant. Here, I start stating the obvious. Back to the late 70s, at the beginning, let's say, when development economics was not yet mainstream economics, we knew that the non-separability of market in many low-income and fragile settings. Households are both, in these settings, households are both producer and consumer of food. So market access is not only about selling output, okay, but it's also the element that shape basically what a family can buy, eat, what they can afford. And what strikes me also from the results from the literature review is that most of the impact evaluation focus on the supply side, mainly supply side outcomes, sales, farm income. But there is the other side, the consumption side, that is neglected, and even more the food security and nutrition side. Shannon highlighted that the impact on food security the study that's about the impact on food security are inconclusive or scant. So from a FAO perspective, this is where I think we need more research, and also to understand how these results are, these impact are inconclusive, meaning that I do think that as was Etienne was what I was saying before, it's really the enabling environment around the markets that determine what make the system works. So the information flow, the coordination mechanism, the institution, the people, okay, behind. And if I can suggest something for future research, is putting this element into the picture, because it is needed to understand whether better market translate in better diet and livelihood gain, but also food security gain for all. And if not, who is winning, who is losing it's another thing that we should state clearly. Not always, let's say, there is this Pareto optimal movement. So improving access to the market does not automatically improve the condition of all the players involved. So there could be a redistribution of welfare between producer and consumer. There could be an increasing inequalities between consumer located more closer or far away from the market. So those that are more integrated, those that are less integrated, rural and urban area, and so on and so forth. The second element that I would like to highlight in terms of research gap is that increasing participation in markets is very important, but what is understudied is the quality of this participation. The degree of agency, the bargaining power, the stability dimension remains often under-researched. So future studies should focus not only on answering this question, are farmers selling? Because usually from also survey that we create the variable, does farmer sell? And we establish this as our proxy of access to the market. But it's also important capture information on what terms they are selling, with what risks, and what are their ability to choose where and what to sell. Okay, and complementing what David was saying, probably we have to be, and also Hope mentioned, we have to be creative and to the standard impact evaluations, both experimental and quasi-experimental design, we can complement with ex-ante experimental design, DCE, lab in the field, to elicit the stated and the revealed preferences of the stakeholder involved in the value chain is important. Also to align the incentive, that was one of the point of the previous point. No? So the goal is not just document whether market works, but once again, put the people at the center, understand how they can be better designed to work for people. And I repeat, because it is part of FAO motto, I like a lot, leaving no one behind. This is one important element that we should always take in consideration. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then I have a final question to the each of you, but I'm conscious of time, so I think if you can be brief. So at 3IE, we've seen a significant increase in the evidence base, and Hope, you mentioned, that there has been a lot of interest in investment in impact evaluations across sectors over the last couple of decades. But policy and practice often continue to operate in parallel from research evidence. So how can we ensure that the research that's being generated is used, and particularly in a context with limited resources? So your thoughts on that, and so let's start with you, Hope.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. So I'll go back to a point that's related to something that David said in his initial remarks, which is, I think one thing that I find very rewarding and I hope impactful in this regard is strong and consistent collaborations with research and research institutions that are based in the country where you're working. And, making those investments takes time to build trust and effort and, and patience on both sides, and and the rewards are significant, but they take a long time to pay off. And there are good models for this. I think the CGIAR system is a great network of institutions and they're very connected to policy. And I have both worked with them in really substantive ways and also, used their connections to build research networks within the countries where I want to work. I think there's really no substitute for that. The times that I've been able to do that meaningfully, and those are the folks that really understand the local policy context, that really have the connections with local, local policymakers. And I think that's just so important. So if anything, I've been kind of pushing people that are in positions where they can control funding to create, funds to support those kinds of relationships developing, over time. So, just collaborations, having more face-to-face interactions and that. So the other thing I want to say is, with USAID is effectively gone and it's not coming back in the near term. And at least for me, that was a real primary focus, and a primary audience for the kind of work that I was doing. So, through my own experience and lens, which I think has some kind of generalizable aspects for other people, that loss of USAID has like fragmented the evidence landscape, I think, a lot in terms of, who you're pitching things to and who has the appetite for what you're generating. And that fracturing hasn't really coalesced yet, and there's risk that evidence won't be taken up because that institutional conduit is so weakened right now. I mean, this is something that I see, and I'd love for people to tell me I'm wrong about this. The supply is still there. There's still lots of researchers generating this work. The problems are not going away. So I've been trying to think about the kinds of opportunities that there is, maybe by pivoting away from this one big audience, there's an opportunity to focus more on local or regional governments in low and middle income countries, different kind of South-South research engagement that we could help provide some evidence to, depending on what kind of demand there is. Those national actors may have more scope to implement and to take up evidence, but there's risk that evidence can become more localized and more, politicized and more driven by local incentives. So there's good and bad things about that. But I will say, just as my last point, I think institutions like 3IE have a real opportunity here and even a responsibility to help lead this and try to think about, how do we identify those audiences? There's a real appetite to find, what those entry points are into this new landscape. And I hope 3IE can help with that.
Great. I hope so too. Thank you. So David, same question to you. What do you think can be done to strengthen the culture of evidence use in the sector?
It's a great question, and it speaks volumes to my own experience, my own career, both the good and bad of it. I think a lot of us working in this particular space recognize that evidence doesn't always shape investment choices, policy choices, regulatory choices in the decision-making spaces we care about. So we know that there are lots of political, economic, and social, and cultural factors that are beyond our control, and beyond the influence of the evidence that we generate to shape future interventions, programs, policies, and investment choices. I think of the work that my colleagues and I have done in Uganda for the last decade or so on agricultural extension, recognizing that the agricultural extension system is largely run by the army now to deliver inputs to farmers, and that the Ministry of Agriculture's extension system is, a shadow of its former self. And, no matter how much research you do, you don't go up against the army and say, hey, you could be better. You could do this better. That's just not a conversation we have in Uganda. Whereas in Ethiopia, we have that conversation time and time again, and it's a great conversation because the government of Ethiopia actually wants to hear the evidence and wants to know where it should invest or where it shouldn't. And I've always enjoyed, those conversations, likewise in India, in Rwanda, and elsewhere where I've worked. But I think going forward for all of us working in this space, including and especially 3IE, IFPRI, CGIR, and the partnerships we have, for instance, with Hopes University or with FAO, what we also need to do is sort of synergize our evidence generation, our systematic reviews and our impact evaluations with the other factors sort of shaping decisions. So we need to understand the political economy of where our evidence is positioning itself. We need to understand policy processes. We need to understand national budget cycles and planning cycles in order to make our research more relevant, more salient, and more timely. Otherwise, we abstract away from that and we're just a lot less relevant and more esoteric. But I think the greatest moments in my own experience, in my own career, has been when we've generated evidence of a diverse nature, ex ante, ex post, formative, summative type work, all at the same time with different tools and methods. At that exact point when policymakers, for instance, are making hard choices about, how to allocate budgets or how to plan for the next 5 years. So when our research is relevant, salient, and strategic and timely like that, to me, that's the sweet spot in what we do. Doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's just fantastic. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Some excellent points there that maybe we can get back to. Antonio, over to you.
Yes, I will try to be brief. Basically, of course, this is the most relevant question for me working at FAO, because at FAO we aim, let's say, to inform evidence-based policy. I have to say, David, shaping policy is already, let's say, even a dream. I would be happy just to inform policies process with evidence. That would be already a good objective for me. And why sometimes we didn't manage to do that is because improving evidence use is not only about generating more study. Okay, it's also, from my experience, a matter of ownership. So it's about creating incentive, relationship, trust that make this evidence actionable. In agri-food system, in general, my point of view is that the most binding constraint is not the availability of data, is the disconnection between who produce evidence and who must act on it, let's say. So a true culture of uptake emerges when we co-produce credible, continuous, and not externally driven evidence. And how to do this, of course, try to involve decision maker, researcher, practitioner all together from the beginning. In my division, I am the office in charge of a pillar that is called policy reform, intelligence, monitoring, and evaluation. Although I am more focused on the evaluation component, let's say. And this is the name, at least, summarize this idea that we are able to support or inform the policy making before the policy is implemented, monitoring the policy once it's implementing, and evaluate after the policy implementation to feed, let's say, a policy circle. So we close the policy circle from beginning to the end, and so we feed, let's say, new, better informed policy in the next iteration. This is, once again, easier to say than to do. Sometimes we have been called to enter a different stage of the policy process, so we can be involved just for the evaluation or just before the implementation to provide analytics that helps to frame the policy issue. I think it depends also on us, how we are, how we can be able to find a way to involve decision maker, researcher, and practitioner from the beginning. Is part of what I see is already happening, but we are still lagging a little bit behind. And the last thing that I think is an important element is that to maintain credible systems, no, we need to generate data consistently and in a transparent way. And so ensuring that the data that we collect and generate is open source, making metadata, sampling frame, and method used to collect the data public accessible, because the culture of evidence use depending also on the trust in the data. And this will create a feedback loop, because where data informed decision may reinforce the demand for better data. And this is what we should aim to. It's not only for policymaker, let's say, but also for researcher. It's a win-win situation overall. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions from the audience that I'd like for you to volunteer to respond to. So I'm going to summarize a couple of questions, and then I think we'll do a round of you responding to some, all, or none of the questions as you see fit. So there is a question around metrics. So beyond the typical economic and environmental metrics, how might we measure success of these interventions in terms of community well-being and maintenance of local traditions and practices? So key social and cultural indicators that are important for smallholder agriculture. Then there is a question around the demand for impact evaluations. So from what, so how to overcome a challenge in lacking knowledge and willingness to adopt impact evaluations. Then there is a question around, so Shannon flagged this issue of limited evidence on food security outcomes. So the question is really thoughts around why we're seeing this gap and what factors might be limiting the ability of market access interventions to translate into improved security outcomes at the household level. And then I think there were also some questions around reporting bias and publication bias that perhaps you could speak to as well briefly, Shannon. So maybe you've been silent for a while, Shannon, so maybe we'll start with you.
Yes, I'll try to quickly address Hope's points because I know we are running out of time. So for risk of bias assessments, when we're saying reporting bias, we're talking about really what you said. Studies in their pre-analysis plans have indicated that they are going to report on a specific outcome, and they don't in the report. And so that sort of file drawer, it probably wasn't significant, and it would have been really great to see it. And it's a little concerning that we're not. And so that's one of the things. To your point about RCTs as the gold standard, we often see RCTs that are done poorly are not as good as QEDs that are done really well. So like huge differential attrition that's unaccounted for, clear evidence that the randomization didn't work because there's huge differences at baseline that are not in any way considered in analyses, things like this that can be quite challenging.
I think also that's really interesting and maybe a contribution, and like maybe there's scope for like a tiny little brief that talks about that?
Maybe a
'Cause
nice
I
little
think,
blog.
yeah, that's a really interesting thing because you've really had an opportunity to evaluate multiple dimensions of a range of studies. And
Yes.
I'll just say I've been a part of some reviews that are led by JPAL or by VoxDev, where they only focus on RCTs. Like that's all they are willing to let in. And I think that that insight's a really important insight, you know? So
Yeah. And I think specifically about spillovers, you know, it's often that we actually are underestimating effects, right? Because control participants are getting something, and so those differences aren't as large as they probably would be without the spillover effects. So another thing to consider. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Hope, any
I guess I'll take the food security one briefly.
yeah?
I mean, I think I have a bunch of work on measuring food security. Like, we're really bad at it. So I think part of it might just be that that field has a lot of measurement of food security has a lot of opportunities and potentials to characterize it in a positive way. Every time I say the number of food security indicators that we've got right now, somebody corrects me, and there's even more. So I think within the academic literature, maybe there's like 7 or 8 that folks are using. There's pretty clear evidence now that some of those are tightly correlated and some of them are measuring very different or sensitive to very different kinds of changes and dynamics in the household. So I think I would first just kind of take a careful look at that. And like, maybe if the households are above some threshold level of food security, that's not where they're going to invest their, new income. That just may not be what you want to do. So you also might want to take a look at what the level is of the households at baseline and sort of more carefully calibrate where you think, what your hypotheses are about whether you'd expect those things to change. So that's a demand side. Then there's sort of supply side questions about if they can even access the kinds of foods that would move the indicators that we're using. So it's a really interesting topic. I hope people spend more time thinking about it. It's great.
Thank you. Antonio.
Yes, if I may, because this is also the question that are more relevant for FAU, I think. I think it's depend also how you measure food security. This is the point. Sometimes we measure only one dimension of food security. We claim that this is a food security indicator. It is, but it's not a complete indicator. And for the more complex indicator, those that goes to refer to caloric intake, but even nutrition intake, we lack sometimes conversion table for the country. And at that time, and the data suffer of a huge recall bias, and sometimes are also a lot of missing value, because if I ask you exactly what you have eaten last week or since last week, I bet that none of you may recall exactly the quantity and different item that they have consumed. So this could be a problem that make the results on food security more inconclusive. The second is that from improving market access, improving livelihood to food security, there is a long pathways that may be, let's say, contaminated at every level by multiple disruptor or unobserved factor that may confound the estimation of the causal effect on food security. So there is technical reasons, but also measurement issue. And just to the second one, I will leave the floor to David about how we make the impact evaluation, how we can anticipate the impact evaluation at the time of the projects. This is the $1 million question. How we can anticipate, because we know that impact evaluation is needed. The problem is how we can make it happen, how we can sit at the same table with project implementers, sometimes in humanitarian or protracted crisis context, and convince them that evaluating the impact is important, and we are not undermining the actual treatment that is the humanitarian or the development intervention. I think this is the key. More than anticipating is how to make it happen.
And then David.
Sure. Let me tackle the first question from an anonymous attendee about measuring the success of these interventions in terms of community well-being and the maintenance of local traditions and practices. I think the question can be answered similarly to how Hope and Antonio answered the question on measuring food security. There are certainly measures, indicators, and metrics on community well-being, collective action, and the maintenance of local traditions and practices. It really depends on what you're interested in, but there is a rich literature on how to measure these types of outcomes. I guess we don't focus on them too much because there's not much of an underlying theory of change on how market interventions affect community or collective well-being, or common pool resource management, for instance, or the maintenance of local practices. And that may be something that we routinely leave out because it could be an unintended negative consequence of market interventions. Or there could be positive outcomes as well from a market intervention that enables communities to, for instance, manage their groundwater or their pastures, more effectively, or their cultural traditions more effectively. I mean, again, I know this from my own experience, for those of you that have worked in Pakistan, in northern Pakistan, for instance, where I did with the Aga Khan Foundation many years ago, there was always this really interesting question about, what happened to the collective action of these very egalitarian rural villages when one person had sort of deviated from the norm in the village and started making big money on things like seed potato or trade with China, or getting remittances from down country that others didn't. So all of a sudden you had all of these market opportunities and one individual was benefiting, but the question was, well, what was happening to the community as a whole that had helped raise that individual up to that level in terms of their various talents and capabilities and access to credit and things. So that's always been a sort of a thorny issue that sits at the back of my head when we talk about market interventions, is what happens to the collective. Just to say, in response to the anonymous attendee, maybe this is, part of our theories of changes that we have to explore more deeply because they do matter. They really, really are an interesting question that I think everybody should be asking. So I just encourage more work in that field. It could be fantastic. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. This has been a very rich discussion, and I think some important points around quality and how we define quality, as it also relates to how we ensure that the evidence is being used and useful. So I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion. So thanks again to the panelists and to the whole team at 3IE who's made this event possible. Thanks to all of you for joining us. The live stream of this video has been uploaded to 3IE's YouTube channel. And if you want to continue the discussion on Twitter, please tag at 3IE News in your tweets. And you can also subscribe to email updates from 3IE by visiting our website, 3ieimpact.org, and to learn more about future events in the Evidence Dialogue series. So hope to see you all soon, and have a nice rest of your day wherever you are, and however long there is left of it. Take good care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.